Rachael Denhollander.
Thank you. It is truly a privilege to be here this morning in the company of so many of you who have been on the front lines of protecting our children for so long. As a mother, it is a privilege to be here in memory of Brooke and to see the incredible work that her legacy has left. The work you are doing is near to my heart because I know firsthand the absolutely vital importance of receiving support and care when you have been a sexual assault survivor.
Excuse me just a second, Rachel.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure folks can hear. People can hear?
No.
Let me just make sure this is...
I think it's on. I think the problem is my soft voice.
Well, that is not the mic. This is the mic. That's his. He's taping him, so that's fine. Let me just see if. Is it okay?
Yeah. Just keep going.
I don't see how loud. You just made it.
Speak up. Is that any better? I can try yelling. I'm a mom. I can yell.
Okay, that might be better.
All right. Any better in the back? Okay. All right. So as an attorney, a public policy advocate, and a sexual assault survivor who has had to navigate both the criminal and civil justice system, I have experienced firsthand the incredibly powerful role that public policy plays in bringing justice for survivors, in deterring predators, and especially in communicating to survivors that their voices matter and that they are heard. So it is encouraging to me to see this room filled with people who are taking time out of their days and schedules to be advocates. My hope is that by the end of this morning and our time together, we will have fully grasped how to prevent child sexual abuse, or more fully grasped, and how to support the survivors in your state. And this is no easy task, because as those of you know who have done this work for a long time, the statistics are staggering. The problem is broad and devastating. Overall, the best studies indicate that approximately 1 in 4 girls will be victims of sexual assault by the time they reach adulthood, and 1 in 6 boys, and many experts believe this is underestimated. This means that a significant number of the children you are personally in contact with either have already been abused or are at a high risk for experiencing sexual abuse. And what we do to protect these children, to support those who have already been victimized, is absolutely key in bringing healing and in prevention. It is key for healing because according to the best research, sexual assault has by far the most extensive and longest-term impact on survivors compared to all other crimes with surviving victims. Compared to their peers who have experienced other forms of trauma other than sexual assaults, sexual assault victims are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression. They are 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They are 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. Just as importantly, we also know that the depth of the damage from abuse and the ability of the victim to heal is definitively linked to the response that the victims receive when they articulate their abuse. So state leaders and advocates, this means that how you support these precious children who have suffered, the resources that are available to them, is foundational to their healing. You have a direct impact on how well they will recover from the trauma that they have suffered. How survivors are supported through healing is also vital in preventing the abusive cycle. Research also shows that approximately 1/3 of sexual offenders are themselves juveniles. Out of that 1/3 that are juveniles, anywhere between 40 and 80%, depending on the studies that you look at, of juvenile sexual offenders are first themselves victims of sexual abuse. So how we support children who have suffered abuse themselves has a direct and clear impact on breaking the cycle of abuse that too often fills our communities. All of this information should also impress upon us the incredible importance not just of supporting survivors, but of preventing abuse in the first place, doing everything we can to stop childhood sexual assault. And very often, it is easy to think of things like law or politics as partisan or disgusting, or as dry and boring topics. But what I want you to understand this morning is that your public policy matters. Your public policy impacts real children, real people with bodies and hearts and minds and souls. And it does it two ways. First, the laws that you pass determine whether survivors have any real ability to pursue justice or find help. Your laws determine foundational questions like, can a crime even be charged? Do we have a statutory category for this offense? We are working through this in Michigan right now with a female genital mutilation case. It was charged under a federal statute that a judge has recently ruled unconstitutional, and prosecutors are now having to scramble to try to find some way to charge physicians that genitally mutilated 2 little girls, because we don't have a statutory category for what they went through. So those very threshold issues are foundational. Does your statute of limitations even give the ability to pursue justice? Do our evidentiary codes allow for the best types of evidence in sexual assault cases to be used and brought into the court system? Does our sentencing adequately deter predators and punish those who have offended? Does it adequately protect your society from those who are a known risk? Your laws will determine whether institutions and individuals who enable and harbor predators are incentivized to report, whether victims of institutional sexual abuse can seek compensation and restitution through your civil justice system. Your laws will determine the type of resources that are available to allow investigators and advocacy centers to do the work that they need to be able to do, and what help is available for the families that are suffering. In every single facet, from prevention to reporting to seeking justice and helping heal, your laws have a direct and substantial impact on sexual assault survivors. Beyond these very practical matters, your laws and how you talk about them sends a message. It communicates what you value. It communicates what you will compromise on, what price you can be bought for, how much your children are worth. Predators and enablers will watch you to see how you discuss these issues, to calculate the risk to themselves if they abuse or if they harbor an abuser. And survivors will watch what you do. They will understand by your words and actions how much you, as leaders in this state, really care about them. Perhaps more than anything, what you are going to do in this legislative chamber sets the tone and the culture for your state, and it will drive everything else that happens. You can change the best public policy, but if you don't change the hearts, you have already lost the battle. And what you say and how you communicate is the foundational step for whether or not you change those hearts. And sometimes the best way to understand what I mean is to see what it really looks like. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of our time together is simply tell you my story and the story of hundreds of other survivors, and to show you what it looks like when leaders do or don't do the job that they are supposed to do. In this story, you will see reflected perhaps areas where Vermont has done very well with their public policy, or areas where you need to discuss what needs to be done better. And what I hope you understand more than anything at the conclusion is that what you do on this legislative floor matters, and it will impact children in ways that you will never see. I understand this personally because I wasn't just sexually assaulted by Larry. I was actually sexually assaulted when I was 7, first, in my local church. I was fortunate because a group of caring adults that had been through advocacy training saw warning signs and they cautioned my parents. My parents also acted immediately, not even knowing that abuse had already occurred. And because of these trained adults, I was spared from worse abuse. Unfortunately, I also experienced the converse social response. Many others in the church did not respond well, including many of my parents' closest friends. Adults that I had grown up with, that I loved, who I thought had protected me. Instead of supporting my parents' efforts to keep me safe, they believed we had attacked this person. At 7, I hadn't yet verbalized the abuse, and the warning signs seen by counselors were not enough to motivate our friends to protect me. It was enough to motivate them to isolate me and my family. They became icy and distant and cold. And by ages 8 and 9, I was trying to heal from abuse that I didn't understand, that I could not verbalize, and also to try to understand why I had lost my church and all of our closest friends. 4 years later, when I understood enough to begin to tell my parents what had happened and asked questions about that time period in our life, the pieces started to fall into place. And the first lie that I believed was planted then. If you cannot prove your abuse, do not speak up, because you will lose everything. And at the exact time I was internalizing this message, 2 hours away in northern Lansing, another little girl was living that message in a way that would alter the course of my life 3 years later. A young girl named Larissa Boyce was a gymnast at Michigan State University in their youth gymnastics program, and she was being sexually abused by Larry. And Larissa did what a child is told to do. She went and found a trusted adult. She told MSU's head gymnastics coach, Kathy Klages, and another courageous 14-year-old went and reported too. They described to Kathy in graphic detail what Larry was doing to them, telling her they were being fingered like a boyfriend would. But in Michigan, coaches are not mandatory reporters. And in Michigan, the statute of limitations on prosecuting a failure to report is so short that by the time that crime is discovered, there is nothing that can be done about it. And what that means is that there is no incentive for adults who receive disclosures of abuse to actually tell someone. So instead of picking up the phone and calling the police, Kathy picked up the phone and she called Larry. And she told Larry about the problem. And she told Larry she had taken care of it. And she sent Larissa back for more medical treatment. She humiliated these two girls in front of the youth gymnastics team, in front of the collegiate gymnastics team, and then she picked up a report form. She waved it in front of Larissa, and she said, "I could report this, but there will be consequences for you and Larry if I do." See, Kathy knew what she was supposed to do, but she had no incentive under Michigan law to do it.
And so she put that into her report form in the drawer. Larissa is one of the first known victims of Larry. Almost all of us came after that report in 1997. And 3 years later, I walked into Larry's exam room door, and I became a statistic too. As the abuse escalated, I questioned more, and I fell into the lie that so many of our culture believed. Someone like Larry couldn't be an abuser. He was so respected. He was so renowned. He was treating young girls every single day. And at 15 years old, the only rationalization I had in my mind was surely if this was wrong, he would have been caught. Somebody would do something. And I believed that. And so I lay still. And I continued believing that the problem was me.
I chastised myself for even thinking Larry could be doing something wrong. What kind of person was I to be thinking that about another human being? I blamed the victim, like the rest of our society does. I blamed myself. And when he finally crossed a line that I knew was abuse, I felt helpless and completely hopeless. What could I, a 15-year-old no-name gymnast, possibly do to stop an internationally renowned physician like Larry, backed by a national governing Olympic body and one of our biggest Big Ten universities? And what I didn't know at that time is that under Michigan law, the clock to seek justice, both civilly and criminally, was already ticking. Because at 15, I recognized that I had been abused, and that triggered our statute of limitations. I had all of 3 years to press criminal charges and 6 months to seek civil restitution. But I was completely unable to speak up. I was paralyzed by the shame and the fear and the lies that fill the hearts and minds of sexual assault survivors. I knew the statistics on successfully prosecuting sexual abuse. Experts estimate that for every 300 rapes reported to the police, only 7 result in criminal charges. Only 6 result in jail time. I felt hopeless. I didn't know how normal this was. But in fact, most victims of childhood sexual abuse are too traumatized to report until much, much later in life. Studies have shown that roughly 60% of victims often don't tell anyone at all until asked by a researcher. And the median age of disclosure for childhood victims of sexual abuse is approximately age 41 for women and 38 for men. And by the time abuse survivors are able to speak up, the window to justice, civilly and criminally, is closed. The clock was ticking for me at 15 years old, but I was unable to do anything about it. At one point, I reached out for help to a coach in my community, and I told her that Larry had abused me under the guise of medical treatment. And this coach wanted to do the right thing. I still believe she wanted to do the right thing. But tragically, she didn't know what that right thing was. Because she was not a mandatory reporter, she had received zero training on how to handle a disclosure of sexual abuse, and it showed. And the end result was that she cautioned me about saying anything else, because she was concerned about the impact on me if someone found out that I was saying something like this about Larry. I couldn't even get her to stop sending our own athletes to see him. And I knew that if I couldn't get a friend to believe me, no one was ever going to listen. What I didn't know was that same year, before I spoke with my coach, the parents of yet another young girl, Kyle Stevens, told an MSU psychologist that Kyle had disclosed that Larry was sexually abusing her. Now, unlike Kathy and my coach, this psychologist was a mandatory reporter, but he also didn't report. Instead, he brought Larry in to meet with Kyle's parents. Larry denied everything. Her family turned on her. Her father threatened to make her life, quote, a living hell if she said anything else. And Larry walked back into that exam room and continued to abuse girls for 13 more years. And the statute of limitations is so short in Michigan that there is nothing that can be done to bring justice in Kyle's case for this failure to report. And I know he didn't report this because when I reported to my coach later that day, she had a friend of hers who was a police officer run a check to see if there were any other police reports against Larry. Now, by that time, there should have been at least 3 filed, but there were none. So my coach told me not to say anything else. Adults who were mandatory reporters but had no incentive to do their job, and adults who could have reported had they been trained, left me and hundreds of other children alone, isolated and abused, believing the lies that this was all our fault. We know today that at least 16 authority figures at MSU were told of Larry's abuse. Coaches, trainers, psychologists, other medical experts. Not a single one picked up the phone and reported. Not a single one can be held accountable under Michigan law for what they did. For the next 16 years, I watched and I waited to see if there was even a hope of being believed. I checked the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution once, and I knew that it was set to expire on my 25th birthday. I followed up on Larry that year, before I turned 25, hoping for any sign that his facade was weakening, or that MSU or USAG were capable of being held accountable, and there was simply nothing to give me even the least bit of hope. So I woke up on the morning of my 25th birthday and felt nothing but despair, because under Michigan law, I no longer had the right to speak up. It would be 6 more years before I saw the report in the Indianapolis Star that detailed how USAG had been systematically covering up reports of sexually abusive coaches. The story was trending. People were paying attention for the first time to the culture of corruption in that organization, and I knew that now was the time. If anyone was ever going to be willing to believe that their own team physician could be a sexual abuser, it was now. So I wrote to the Indy Star right away, and I told them I would do anything if they could just make the truth come out. And when I wrote, I revisited the statute of limitations. My hope was to tell the reporters what the window was, so that if they could find other survivors, they could let that survivor know to file a police report, and I would provide the public cover for them and take the heat if they could just get the criminal prosecution rolling. And that's when I saw the first glimmer of hope that I had seen in 16 years. Unbeknownst to me, before my statute expired, the Michigan legislature had made a vital statutory change. there was no longer a statute of limitations in Michigan on criminal sexual assault in the first degree, I could file the police report. I could still speak up. And this moment right here is critical, because if I had not been able to file that police report, the most likely result is that Indy Star would have never published the story. Somebody had to be able to put legal backing behind the story to get it across the hurdle for editors to put it out there in print and take that risk because of the type of accusation that was being made. If that story had not published, the catalyst for what would become a global movement would never have been sparked. A statutory change in Michigan law is directly responsible for catching one of the worst sexual predators in recorded history. And what we now know is that the Michigan police are the only ones who did the right thing. The FBI was actively burying the reports of abuse. They had actually been told of Larry more than a year before and had not even done so much as a victim interview until just a few weeks before I came forward. The Indianapolis Police Department, the head of the Sex Crimes Against Children Division, was a friend of Steve Penny's, the president of USAG. He was actively advising Penny on how to bury the reports of childhood sexual abuse. There were 2 other law enforcement agencies who had been notified by the time I stepped in, and both of them had buried it. Had Indy Star not been able to publish that story because the legislature had done their job and changed the law to give me a voice, what we saw unfold over the last year could not have happened. And there was one more very critical piece of the puzzle from a statutory perspective. Michigan had just made a vital change to the evidentiary code. Under the new Michigan code, testimony of non-charged sexual assault victims could be admitted in childhood sexual assault cases to demonstrate a propensity and a pattern of abuse. For the first time in my life, it meant that it wasn't just my voice. It meant that if I filed a police report and we made it to court, I wasn't alone anymore. Some of the best evidences in childhood sexual assault cases is that propensity evidence, the ability to show a pattern. And because of the legislative changes under Michigan law, we now had that ability. And that gave me hope for the first time in 16 years. As many of you are likely aware, I did file that police report. And after months of investigation and preparing for trial, Larry entered a guilty plea, a deal he was only offered by the prosecutor, Angela Povolitis, because Michigan law made it possible for her to do something that she felt was absolutely vital: give every victim a voice. And the entire world saw what happens when survivors are finally given a voice. They are able to tell the truth. They are able to put the shame and the guilt back where it belongs, on their abuser, and not on them. The ripple effect of what we saw at the Larry Nassar sentencing hearings literally spanned the globe, sparking increased reporting in other countries and other sports organizations, all because Michigan law gave the victims a right to speak in court. But as triumphant as that sentencing was, it was only the beginning. During that year of investigation, it was discovered that not only had MSU abhorrently failed to report Larry many times, so had USAG. In fact, the USAG president had gone so far as to remove medical files from the training facilities in order to cover up what Larry was doing. And a fellow doctor at MSU had also removed medical files at Larry's request during the ongoing police investigation. But under Michigan law, our licensing board for doctors leaves no recourse for that. She was just cleared of any violation, not because she didn't remove the files, not because she didn't interfere with an ongoing police investigation, but because we have no way to hold her accountable for what she did, because there is nothing in our statutory code. And unfortunately, Michigan's mandatory reporting laws left no recourse for survivors, no way to hold MSU accountable for the sexual assault of hundreds of little girls that had gone on for decades under their watch after 14 adults were told of it. And with no other recourse available, we turned to the civil courts, only to discover that Michigan was one of the worst states in the entire country for justice for sexual assault survivors. for even giving survivors access to the court system. Contrary to everything we know about the inability of childhood sexual assault survivors to report, Michigan had an impossibly tiny window. Even worse, our sovereign immunity statutes in Michigan provide complete immunity to any government entity, including schools and universities, some of the places where the most rampant forms of sexual abuse takes place. There is no incentive under Michigan law for universities and schools to report sexual abuse because they have complete immunity from any liability for their failure to do so. It was not that we did not have a case. It was not that we did not have evidence. It was that we were not even allowed to argue it. Around this time, I began receiving messages from survivors of other forms of many institutional abuses, everything from other public school systems to the Catholic diocese. And I began to realize what a powerful weapon the statute of limitations is in the hands of predators and enablers. It meant that these organizations could refuse to report predators, even actively cover it up, and suffer zero repercussions. It meant that hundreds of children would be abused years after the abuser could have been stopped and had no recourse for getting help when they were finally able to speak up. Knowing that the survivors of Larry's abuse had a media presence in a way that other abuse survivors never would, I sat down with key senators to discuss desperately needed statutory reform, from criminal codes and evidentiary to civil codes. More than anything, I wanted these survivors who didn't have a voice, who nobody was listening to know that they mattered. But what happened was despicable. We put together a comprehensive package. It got through the Senate with no problems. But after the package made it to the Senate, we got to the House. And that began one of the most painful processes for all of us. Just a few months earlier, we had stood in a courtroom in Lansing, Michigan, and detailed our abuse and confronted our abuser. But Michigan House members felt that something else was more important. Specifically, the endorsements, the money, and the political pull that MSU and the Catholic diocese had in our state. House members sold us out. They attacked me for being paid to put together the package, which was a blatant lie. They attacked survivors to the point that a 15-year-old who tried to lobby in front of them left the room in tears after their treatment of her. They refused to disclose that everyone in opposition to our bill was either closely tied to Michigan State University or actively representing the Catholic Church in sexual assault scandals, where there were literally file cabinets of abuse victims in those dioceses that these lobbyists were protecting. The Speaker of the House played political games. He sat in meetings with me and promised me that that package would be passed before our fourth child was born. And he turned around and met with lobbyists and insurance carriers and promised them he would do everything in his power to gut that package. And he did. He played political games with his political opponents. One of our strongest supporters was running against him in a House race for the Attorney General. He told her if her name was even so much as attached to a bill in our legislation, he would stall the whole package to make sure that she got zero political gain, zero political press. He was so desperate to win his race that he played politics with the children of Michigan. The morning we were in mediation with MSU, I got the call that the Michigan House of Representatives was going to refuse to move all of the main bills in our package. And I had to walk into a room filled with childhood sexual assault survivors and tell them that their voices hadn't been enough. Even worse, I had to tell them the next generation was going to remain equally as unprotected, because the main facets that led to one of the worst pedophiles in recorded history were all going to stay the same. The survivors of other institutional abuses who we had advocated for, who still had no voice, still had no access to the justice system. And that morning, I watched sister survivors carrying their first babies place their hands instinctively on their pregnant bellies, realizing that their children they were carrying weren't important enough. I held survivors as they choked back sobs and asked me in between why the children didn't matter. How was it possible that campaign donations, that an endorsement, that a political alliance could be worth more than the children It was a sobering and painful reality. 6 months later, I flew to the Pennsylvania state capitol, and I stood in the state capitol with hundreds of other survivors of sexual abuse who were pleading for a window to justice. And just like in Michigan, their package was stalled out because campaign money and political alliances and endorsements meant more than the children. And I want that image to stay with you, because I want you to remember that what you do here legislatively will not only affect survivors practically, but it will send a message to them. And it will send a message to the predators and the enablers in your state. It will answer the question, Vermont, how much are your children worth? Survivors don't start with the question, what's going to get me ahead in the game? Or what is popular? Survivors start with the question, what is right? And the challenge I leave you this morning is to follow the words of one of our greatest advocates for justice in another form, Martin Luther King Jr. And with this, we will close and open for questions. King once famously wrote, "On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it expedient? And then expedience comes along, and it asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right?" And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. Thank you.